A man kissed his wife goodbye, climbed into his taxi, and headed off for what should have been just another shift. 20 minutes later, his car was crushed by a 65-pound concrete block. It had been deliberately pushed off of a bridge by two men he didn't even know. But here's the thing, he wasn't necessarily the intended target. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. David Wilkie sat behind the wheel of his brown Ford Cortina taxi, the heater humming softly as he navigated the familiar bends of the A465 in South Wales. He was 35, a father of four, and a driver for city centre cars in Cardiff. He wasn't supposed to be any part of any grand story, but this morning he was. Nearly all of the local population were employed in the local coal mines. The singer Sir Tom Jones, himself the son of a miner, had been born nearby. David had driven this route every day for the last 10 days, at the same time with the same fare, so he was very familiar with the route. In front of the taxi was a police outrider, and a police car and another police car was following behind. What they didn't know was that three men were stood high above the A465 on the bridge near the roundabout. They were looking down on where the taxi would join the road to head towards the coal pit at Merthyr Vale. This part of the A465 was a trunk road, known locally as the Heads of Valley Road, because it kind of links the northern heads of the South Wales Valley. At the time, it was a 3-lane road. There were dual lanes towards Merthyr and then a single lane towards Rumney. It was unusual to have people around on this particular bridge so early. They simply stood, talking to each other, two of them looking south and the other talking at them in a kind of animated way it would later be described as. Then they heard the cackle of the police motorbike and the low drone of the car engines as they approached the roundabout ready to turn onto the A465. Now they could see the headlights of the vehicle lighting up the road before them, just as they approached the bridge. This was their signal. Two of the men crouched down and between them, they lifted a 46-pound concrete block, that's about 20 kilograms, and a 65-pound, almost 30 kilograms, concrete post, until they were resting it on the handrail of the bridge. As the vehicles got closer to where the bridge passed over the road, both men moved their weight behind the concrete block and post. Now they could see the taxi had 3 police escort vehicles, but that wasn't going to make any difference to what they were about to do. It just meant they would need pinpoint accuracy for their plan to be successful. These men had had time to think about this. They had to really take time to get those concrete blocks or that post up and onto the handrail, and then hold them there and wait. The police outrider passed under the bridge, then the first police car. Now, as the taxi reached the bridge, the two men shifted their weight behind that concrete block and post and managed to kind of push it forward and made it tumble off the bridge handrail. After what seemed like minutes to the men on the bridge, but in reality was only a second or so, there was what sounded like a deafening thunderclap as that concrete block struck the taxi, crushing the windscreen and metal. And the sound was so loud and so noticeable that witnesses reported seeing, and this is the kind of things you see in films, where there's this noise loud enough that it kind of startles birds into the surrounding trees. And so there was this flurry of birds into flight in unison. And this was super memorable to people who were there that day because there was just such confusion trying to figure out what was going on, what was happening. It meant that they really paid attention to every single detail they could. They didn't understand this early in the morning what could possibly have made that deafening sound. The taxi veered off the road onto the embankment, and then, as the police vehicles braked to a sudden stop, silence. The officers in those other vehicles were just unable, in that moment, to understand what had just happened. After that moment of disbelief, the officers threw open the doors of their vehicles and they ran to the taxi. In the back, the passenger, and this next part is so surprising to officers given what they'd just witnessed, but the passenger actually seemed to be shaken for sure, but not badly injured. It seems that the front of the vehicle had taken most of the damage, I suppose, and in the front, where that concrete block had landed without bouncing, the combined effect of the weight and the Earth's gravity ensured that once it had completed that kind of drop down, it came into contact with the car and it just stopped. It wouldn't move again after the car came to a stop. And that meant that the driver lay unable to move and unable to be moved because of that wreckage pinning him down. It is such a horrible thing to kind of think about, the weight of that rock, the shock of what's just happened, and then this man lying there completely unable to move or be moved. The men on the bridge started to run. The police immediately radioed for urgent assistance from the fire and ambulance service, which did arrive quickly together with detectives. The fire officers started by assessing the scene, and they quickly realised they were going to need to cut the driver out of the taxi. It took some time, but they worked as quickly as they possibly could, and thankfully they did manage to release him and get him into the ambulance that was waiting right there. The driver was David Wilkie, a loving fiancé, a father of 4 children, the youngest of which would be born in 2 months' time. But David would never get to see that birth. He hadn't stood a chance. He'd been dead seconds after the concrete block had gone through the windscreen of his taxi. David's death was now a matter for the police, for sure, but also this was a political issue because of the miners' strike. So this meant that the British Prime Minister, the leader of the opposition, and the General Secretary of the most powerful trade union in the country, they were all involved. It may have also changed the historical direction of the UK. In 1984, 2 giants of power in Britain squared up for a struggle that would last over a year, and from which one side would emerge seemingly victorious. On one side was Margaret Thatcher, leader of the Conservative Party and elected Prime Minister of the UK, with one of her main priorities to reduce the power and influence of the trade unions. And the most powerful trade union was the National Union of Miners. On that side was Arthur Scargill. He was president of the National Union of Miners, and he was an ex-miner and ex-communist. He claimed that the Conservative government had a long-term strategy to destroy the coal industry in Britain. The confrontation was set, and on March 12, 1984, a miners' strike that had already started in Yorkshire became an official national strike. The summer ahead meant that demand for power would be at its lowest, and the Conservative government had just built up huge stocks of coal to be used to fuel the power stations in the event of a miners' strike. The strike dragged on for months, with some areas like South Wales solid, whilst other areas like Nottinghamshire continued to work because there hadn't been a national ballot of members to authorise strike action. And what this meant was that it led to violence, miners against the police, coalfield against coalfield, and even miner against miner. In South Wales, where David drove his taxi, it felt like a revolutionary battle was being fought, the people versus the state. There was no need for picketing there, where striking miners would wait outside coal pits to persuade working miners to join the strike because the strike was solid. There were no strike breakers. But in other areas, there were. So strikers would gather outside coal pits to loudly argue their case with miners going to work. Police had to be on hand to stop the violence from erupting, and the government, they knew they would need a lot of police to be available, so they kind of bussed them in from other parts of the country where there weren't coal mines and so they weren't seen as needed in those places. each morning on TV and reported in the newspapers, there was the spectacle of both sides releasing wildly different figures for the number of miners who'd crossed the picket lines in an attempt to show their side was winning. But by November of 1984, with no money coming in to feed families or pay bills, some miners in even the most solid of areas were beginning to break the strike and were being helped by the police to get back to work. They were desperate. But in South Wales, where whole communities existed just to mine coal, and where everything depended on coal, if you broke the strike and tried to work, you were called a scab. And as far as the strikers were concerned, you were betraying your colleagues by undermining the strike. But if you were a scab, you lived next door to a striker. You shopped with a striker. You drank with a striker. Everyone knew everyone. David Wilkie, though, wasn't a scab or a coal miner. He was a taxi driver working in Treforest Village, close to Merthyr Vale Mine, and he drove this Ford Cortina for city centre cars. We know he had these 2 children from a previous relationship, and he continued to kind of maintain them financially. And he also had another daughter with his current partner, who was also pregnant with their son. David was one of the 60 drivers who worked at the taxi company, and he was one of the most popular. He was always laughing, always joking, and was described by other drivers as a real nice guy. He was known to be a good father. He loved his kids and he obviously provided for them. He was known as being a good worker as well. He was never late for work. He was someone you could depend on. The taxi company where he worked for started 10 years earlier, and by now they were pretty busy and they had held a contract with the National Coal Board, the owners and managers of the pits, for a number of years. They started taking strikebreakers to the pit without really realising the potential consequences, although nobody could have imagined what would happen on that day, on November 30th, 1984. It was just another fare, like picking someone up from Cardiff Station and taking them to their destination. It was just part of the job. By November 1984, it was clearer that things were getting more difficult for the strikers. City centre cars were taking more and more desperate strikebreakers back to work. They weren't necessarily taking sides, they were just doing their job. And what really struck me about this case was everyone who's going back to work in the mines or going to work like these taxi drivers, it seems like they're really just trying to survive. And it's kind of hard to imagine today. I think when I was growing up, there was a little bit of difficulty in getting a job. And now, even though the cost of living is extortionate, it is mostly possible to get a job if you are able, even if it's working somewhere that has high turnover of staff, like a coffee chain or a fast food restaurant. That just wasn't the case back in the 1980s. And I have to kind of remind myself about that because I wasn't around then. So one, I didn't know what it was like, but also I don't have a family that I need to support. And I can imagine if you do, you just have to be prepared to work in whatever way possible to support them. Anyway, a meeting was held with all the taxi staff and there was an anonymous vote on whether to continue to take the strikebreakers to the pits. If they voted yes, only drivers who volunteered would drive the strikebreakers. The vote was 85% in favour of continuing, but there were a few drivers who, for family reasons, couldn't volunteer to drive, which was understandable because in such a close-knit community, any driver who did might have had to face those miners who were on strike, and of course, that could lead to a number of difficult things. So, it was on the 30th of November that David Wilkie picked up his fare, this strikebreaker, and started his journey to Merthyr Vale Colliery. He was escorted by these 2 police cars and police outrider, and this route would take them underneath that bridge. And we know that waiting on the bridge were these men, and there were actually 3 men. 2 of them were the ones that lifted those concrete blocks, and one was a kind of bystander, and I'll talk about him a little bit later. They pushed these blocks over the top of the bridge with the intention of stopping the taxi from reaching the colliery. Instead, It crashed through the windscreen of the taxi and crushed David Wilkie to death. The owner of the taxi company said, quote, "On the day it happened, I was just getting up at 4:30 to 5 a.m, sorting myself out to go to work, and I had a call from the police. It was a hell of a shock. Throughout the day, you can imagine, I was in a bit of a state. Fortunately, I had a solicitor alongside me all day helping me discuss things with people and what we were going to do. It was just a daze, really. Thankfully, there were no plans for anybody to go to work over the weekend anyway, so it gave me a bit of thinking time." At about the same time, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's press secretary sent her a memo. It read, quote, "News has reached us of an incident in the coal dispute. A 3-foot concrete garden post was thrown from a bridge onto a taxi carrying a South Wales miner to work at the Merthyr Vale colliery. The driver of the taxi was trapped and as a consequence was killed. The miner escaped unhurt. Because of the allegations of police harassment to pickets, the police have agreed to hold a press conference today. I have said you are horrified and utterly condemn this murderous activity." She would later tell the press, quote, "My reaction is one of anger at what this had done to a family of a person only doing his duty and taking someone to work who wanted to go to work." The Labour leader of the opposition said, "I feel complete horror at this awful tragedy and send my deepest sympathies to David Wilkie's loved ones. I asked whoever did this terrible thing to come forward now. Others have died and been terribly injured in the course of this dispute. Miners and their families are appalled by what has been happening, and I know that they, like me, want the violence to stop and to stop now." Arthur Scargill, the leader of the National Union of Miners, said he'd been deeply shocked by the tragedy of David Wilkie's death. One union official said, "I felt physically sick that someone had died as a result of the actions of one of our members." At the picket line outside the colliery, that day, miners were told to go home. One said, "As we were coming home, it gradually got round that this terrible thing had happened, and this taxi driver had been killed by one of the pickets. I wasn't part of it, I didn't know about it, but my wife wouldn't speak to me for a week because she took it personally. We all felt ashamed, not only ashamed, but sad as well." South Wales Police immediately started their investigation, treating the death as a murder inquiry. It was a massive police operation involving 120 detectives. In light of what had happened, the South Wales Chief Constable pledged that police would ensure that any working miner who wished to return to Merthyr Vale colliery would be able to do so. The taxi was taken from the scene to a forensic lab for examination, and a couple of days later, all of David's belongings from the car were returned to his family. At the taxi company office, a kind of automatic collection was put out for David, and within a few weeks, it raised almost £30,000 for his family. That's the equivalent of £100,000 today. And remember that people are really strapped for cash. You can't just make a little bit extra money on the side, or it's really hard to do that. And this collection was purely voluntary. Nobody went around with collection boxes. It was just kind of money being sent in. The two men who caused David Wilkie's death were quickly apprehended by police. They were Reginald Dean Hancock and Russell Shankland. They both stood trial and were found guilty of murder by a majority verdict on the 16th of May 1985. And to get to that decision, the jury deliberated for nearly 7 hours. Now, the third man on the bridge, which was the one I briefly spoke about earlier, Anthony Williams, he was found to have actively discouraged them from dropping the concrete block, and he was acquitted. Passing sentence, the judge acknowledged the miners' strike had, quote, "engendered a climate of violence that led to the killing of David. You performed the ultimate act of violence, and for it, you will go to prison for life." Relatives of the convicted sobbed and screamed. One of the strikers buried his head in his hands and gasped, quote, "Oh my God," as he burst into tears. The other stood with his head bowed. His girlfriend fainted and collapsed and was carried from the courtroom. The life sentences caused a bit of an outcry among the striking miners. They felt that the death of David was not a deliberate act and therefore should have been classed as manslaughter. And, on appeal, their convictions were reduced to manslaughter, and their life sentences were replaced with 8-year prison terms, of which they would serve just over half. So they were released on 30th of November 1989. The death of David Wilkie led to a collapse of support amongst the general public for the miners' cause. In any case, union funds were running low, and striking miners had endured almost a year of hardship, with only donations to support their families. With more miners returning to work so they could feed their families, and police protecting coal deliveries, the union's position was weakened. When the National Union of Miners held a special conference on 3rd of March 1985, coalfield delegates narrowly voted to end the strike. The miners returned to work on the 5th of March 1985. After 40 years, the wounds of the miners' strike 1984 to 1985 remain in ex-colliery towns around the country. Most strikebreakers left the industry shortly after the dispute ended because of the animosity that remained between strikers and strikebreakers. After the strike ended, the mines were gradually closed. Coal mining employed over 200,000 miners when the strike ended. By 2022, which is the most recent information that I could find in terms of statistics, it employed just 306. The real losers here, though, were not the leaders of the strike, not Arthur Scargill or the union executive. The real losers were the rank and file working miners, as well as the strikebreakers who had all endured hardship for over a year and had debts for years afterwards and subsequently lost their jobs when the mines closed. The real losers were the communities where they lived that suffered hardship and depression following the closures. And with the level of loss and devastation for the country as a whole, it's hard to say what Margaret Thatcher and her government of that time really did win. The biggest loss of all, though, the life of David Wilkie, a father, a partner, and in the words of his colleagues, a real nice guy.